Now, for more on the Nigerian election, we are joined by Professor of African Politics, Development and International Relations from the University of Pretoria, Christopher Isike. He is a member of the Nigerian Unity South Africa, NUSA, an umbrella body guarding interests of Nigerians living in the country. Prof, good evening and thank you so much for joining us. You've just heard our discussion with Hamza Idris and just giving us an update. Vote counting has started. Do we know the results date? When are they expecting to release the official results? And Hamza mentioned the fact that in some areas where, for instance, the presidential polling station, there's belief that the opposition party leader has won that state. You know, let's talk about those little dynamics. Vote results and the different candidates.
Okay, thank you for having me, and good evening to our viewers. Like you said, the results are coming in trickles. It is said that the president won his own polling units and also won Atiku's polling unit, the main opposition leader. And like Hamza said, Atiku also won in the polling units close to Aso Rock, where the president lives. So that makes it interesting. But none of these results are markers of what the eventual results will be. Okay, so they just, like he said, less than 1,000 people voting around each of those polling units. So results are expected to be announced officially anytime between Monday and Tuesday, depending on what decisions INEC come to in certain places where there were disruptions in the voting, and they could decide, for instance, that in those places voting can take place tomorrow. Otherwise, if they say Monday, it means that they will have to wait for those results to come in and then do an announcement on Tuesday or Wednesday.
Let's speak about the front runners, the two candidates, incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari and Atiku Abubakar. The differences there, that the belief from people on the ground in Nigeria is the fact that President Muhammadu Buhari is seen to be fighting corruption. He's seen to be quite strong and stringent on that side, and Abubakar is seen to be possibly bringing something fresh and his business sense, and because he is a billionaire, if I'm not mistaken, the business sense, and they believe that he'll bring that element to Nigeria. What's your take on both these candidates?
Well, Hamza is correct that there are perceptions around the president being an anti-corruption czar, and that is fighting corruption, which many perceive is a big problem in the country. And then there are those who support Atiku precisely because they feel that the economy is a big issue in the elections, security is another issue, and these people feel that the current president Buhari has failed, in these two areas, and these two areas, interestingly, were the basis of his being elected in 2015. So that's why many have said this is a referendum on the president rather than an election between himself and the main opposition leader Atiku. Well, for me, I think that both positions have valid points. Okay, because if you look at the president, there are question marks around his integrity, although many of his supporters do not agree to this. It's question marks around, for instance, his cabinet, full of very corrupt people. People seem to be corrupt, and the fact that he has not put any law in place since 2015 to actually tackle corruption. So the argument is that you do not fight corruption by merely arresting people or threatening to arrest people or negotiating for returns of stolen monies, and that's what he has done in the last 3 years. Nothing to prevent corruption, and preventing corruption is actually more effective than arresting people. And as a result, many feel that corruption continues in the country. It has not been done.
Now,
dealt with.
The voices, or the little voices that speak of differences between the two, the country's ruling party and the opposition, seemingly believing or adding that both parties will not necessarily bring much change to Nigeria. What's your take on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think so, because both parties have members. In fact, one is I dare say that the APC, most of the research has actually shown that over 80% of the leadership of the APC were former PDP members. Okay, in terms of ideology, both parties do not. There's no difference. There's nothing to separate both parties. So it's people who have moved from one party to the other. Atiku, for instance, was in the PDP, moved to the APC, was welcome, and then when he had to contest, he came back to the APC. And this is how the politicians in Nigeria have moved around these parties. So what should have been fresh would have been a completely new candidate, much more younger than these two. But because of the way politics in Nigeria is configured, it's difficult, you know, for any of these fresh ones like Showore, like Professor Kingsley Moghalu, you know, any of these two to actually have a stab at it.
And the issue of incumbent President Buhari's, you know, taking time in appointing ministers, about plus minus 6 months, and spending a lot of time away from the country, spending time in London for medical treatment, that could be, you know, he's seen as coming across as a bit arrogant or not really caring what the Nigerian people want or what promises he's made to the Nigerian people. What's your take on that particular issue?
Yes, there is some arrogance there in terms of, you know, if you consider the fact that he had actually promised in 2015 that he was going to ensure that public officers do not go abroad for treatment, and then he spent 105 days out of the country just receiving treatment. But I don't think he himself is the real problem. His problem for me are his minders, his managers, those around him, who do not give him the correct assessment, you know, of things. And this kind of bootlicking is part and parcel of, you know, the political configuration of most African countries, and it's unfortunate. Heavy-handed
violence from the state security forces and the support that they seem to have from President Buhari. You know, what does this say about his government and his leadership and the people of Nigeria? What's their feeling with regards to that? Also bearing in mind that the meridian voting age group is, as we saw earlier, is 18.
Yeah. Well, that's another question mark around his integrity, you know, because if you look at what has happened in this election, you'll find that the violence, the enormity of violence compared to 2015 is less this time, but there's a new kind of violent disruption of voting, which is a new form of rigging, where in states like in Lagos, in Rivers, in Oyo, and in Kano, you know, people have just been disenfranchised by thugs who just appear and start flogging people or beating people and threatening and actually shooting and making people not vote in areas where people perceive as strongholds of the opposition. So those kinds of things again put strong question marks around this integrity of the current president that is much talented.
You know, before we run out of time, what's something that's very key, we're looking at the present, looking at the past, but now looking to the future. What advice would you give the winner with regards to, you know, dealing with government issues, dealing with the people of Nigeria's problems, and rebuilding the economy of Nigeria? What would you say if you had the incumbent's ear with regards to the progress of the most populous country on the African continent?
Well, tough one. If I was their political advisor, the first thing I would ask them to do is to restructure the country, and that's fundamental. You know, like I always say, the fundamental problem is that of citizenship inequality. The country is more divided now than it has ever been in our history, and that is as a result of the president's body language and statements he made in 2015, the current president. So if he wins, I would like to see a change in body language, a change in rhetoric. If the Atiku wins, I also like to see him make good on his promise to restructure the country. I have a strong feeling that the minute that restructuring is done and there's agreement on how the country needs to move forward, you know, all other issues will fall into place. The economy will be managed with more patriotism. There will be less corruption. It doesn't take away corruption, but there will be less corruption because more people will become part of the system.
Prof, when you say restructure,
yeah,
the government, restructure the country, what exactly do you mean? Just break it down for us very quickly. You know, so for a better understanding of where the most populous country on the continent is, and you know, we've seen footage, and it really seems appalling.
Yeah, Restructuring for me would mean, you know, for instance, devolution of power, you know, devolving power from the center to the region. There needs to be agreement on what kind of, constituent configurations we want to have. Federating units, if they say states, fine, those states have to become autonomous, so you devolve power from the center to them. And then, you know, there are things that are in the federal list that shouldn't be on the federal list, things like the police. Nigeria is too big a country to be policed by a national police force that is controlled from Abuja. So there needs to be decentralization there. Then there's also the fiscal federalism. That is the finances. That's, you know, where we talk about regions, you know, contributing from their, based on what they derive, and then, you know, getting back from the federal fund, based on what they're contributing. As it is currently configured, it's actually social injustice for the part of the country that provides the bulk of the income and do not get a commensurate measure of the income that they produce. So those are issues, for instance, that need attending to, that, you know, I think are fundamental to how the country is, you know, being run, and the political configuration. Of course, if you talk about devolution of power and the constituents, maybe we can even change our system to become parliamentary, so that people like Showore, people like Momogalu, we have a shot at being in parliament, just like people like Julius Malema have done in South Africa.
Now, do you think that after the results, the official results are made and announced, do you think that both parties or both candidates will accept those results and Nigeria will be able to move forward?
Well, we hope so. The president, his constant answers to this particular question say otherwise. He is not prepared to hand over power. I mean, today he was asked and he said he would not congratulate anybody. He was going to congratulate himself. Maybe it's a function of his confidence. But again, if he does happen to lose the election, people will begin to wonder what would he do. You remember in 2015 how the timely call from Jonathan, the president then, saved the country a lot of bloodshed. So on the other part, Atiku says he's a Democrat, I will hand over power impliedly. So we just hope that, you know, this can be managed properly by both parties, especially considering that they've signed a peace pact to that effect.
You're based in South Africa. You are part of a movement, NUSA, that is basically taking care of, guarding the interests of Nigerians in South Africa. What's the feeling on the ground when you speak to members of your organization, and how they feel about elections taking place currently?
Well, they've been, it's unfortunate that we don't have diaspora voting as yet, but they've been pretty active, and like the situation in the country, people are also divided, you know, between the two candidates, people supporting each of them, you know, strongly, but essentially very orderly in the way that they've managed the whole process, and we all hope for the very best come Tuesday or Wednesday.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure having you in studio. That's Professor of African Politics, Development and International Relations from the University of Pretoria, Christopher Isike, live with us in studio.